The crack of gunfire shattered the silence of the Montana wilderness as Frances Turner clutched her 6-month-old daughter closer to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a frantic bird seeking escape. Blood seeped through the sleeve of her tattered dress where a bullet had grazed her arm, but she wouldn't stop, not when Emma's life depended on it. The year was 1879, and Frances had been running for 3 days straight, ever since her husband's murder at the hands of the Blackwell gang. They'd come for him, claiming he'd stolen from them, but Daniel had been innocent. Now they were hunting her and Emma, eliminating witnesses, searching for the money they wrongly believed she possessed. Her lungs burned as she stumbled through the dense underbrush, the baby whimpering softly against her chest. Frances whispered soothing words between ragged breaths, promising safety she couldn't guarantee. The Montana territory stretched endlessly before her, beautiful, wild, and merciless. "There she is," a gruff voice called out behind her. "Harley, cut her off at the creek." Fresh terror surged through Frances's exhausted body. The bounty hunters were closing in. She'd thought she'd lost them at dawn, but they were relentless, professional killers hired by the Blackwell gang to finish what they'd started. The distant sound of rushing water reached her ears. The creek, her last hope. If she could cross it, maybe she could lose them in the pines on the other side. Emma stirred against her chest, hungry and uncomfortable. Frances blinked away tears. She hadn't been able to properly feed her daughter since yesterday. She broke through the tree line, the creek flowing swift and cold before her. The water wasn't deep, but the current was strong, and Frances felt dizzy from blood loss and exhaustion. She had to try. Behind her, voices grew louder, accompanied by the crashing of men moving through the forest. With a desperate prayer, Frances stepped into the frigid water. The shock of cold stole her breath as she waded in, holding Emma high against her shoulder. Halfway across, her foot slipped on a smooth stone, and she nearly went under, catching herself at the last moment with a strangled cry. The sound of a horse's whinny made her head snap up. On the opposite bank, a tall figure on horseback emerged from the trees, a man in a worn leather vest and cowboy hat, rifle in hand. Another hunter. Her heart sank. There was nowhere left to run. "Madam," the cowboy called, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You're hurt. Let me help you." "Stay back," Frances warned, clutching Emma tighter. "I have nothing for you." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse to a nearby branch before stepping to the creek's edge. "I'm not looking to take anything," he said, his hands raised slightly. "Name's Henry Yates. I've got a cabin just over that ridge. You and your little one look like you could use some help." Frances wavered, the water swirling around her knees. Behind her, the shouts grew closer. Henry's eyes flicked to the trees behind her, then back to Frances. "Those men after you mean business. I can see it in your eyes you're running from something serious." He extended a hand. "I can help, but you need to decide quick." The sound of horses splashing into the creek upstream made the decision for her. Frances lunged forward, stumbling the rest of the way across. Henry's strong arm caught her before she fell. "My horse is just there," he said quickly, already guiding her toward the chestnut mare. "Can you ride?" Frances nodded, too exhausted for words. Henry helped her mount, then swung up behind her in a single, practiced movement. "Hold tight to your baby," he instructed, reaching around her to take the reins. "Keep your head down." They'd barely disappeared into the tree line when the bounty hunters burst through to the creek. Henry guided his horse with confidence through the dense forest, taking paths that seemed invisible until they were upon them. Frances cradled Emma, who had mercifully fallen asleep despite the jarring ride. "They'll follow our tracks," Frances whispered, panic rising again. "Not for long," Henry replied, guiding the horse into a shallow stream that ran down from the hills. Water leaves no trail. And there's a thunderstorm brewing. Rain will wash away what's left. As if confirming his words, a distant rumble of thunder echoed through the mountains. Frances leaned back slightly, allowing herself the smallest measure of hope as they rode steadily upward. True to Henry's word, a small log cabin appeared as they crested a ridge. It was nestled against a rocky outcropping, partially hidden by pines and nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. "It's not much," Henry said as he helped Frances dismount, "but it's sturdy and hard to find." Frances swayed on her feet, the world spinning around her. The last thing she remembered was Henry's concerned face and strong arms catching her as darkness claimed her. When Frances awoke, she was lying on a narrow bed, covered with a thick quilt. "Emma." She bolted upright, ignoring the pain that shot through her arm. "Easy now," came Henry's voice from across the small cabin. "Your little one is just fine." Frances turned to see the tall cowboy sitting in a rocking chair by the fireplace, holding Emma with surprising gentleness. The baby was wrapped in a clean blanket, contentedly drinking from a makeshift bottle. "I had some goat's milk," Henry explained, seeing her confused expression. "Not perfect, but it'll do in a pinch. She was mighty hungry." "Thank you," Frances managed, her throat dry. "How long was I?" "Couple hours. Lost some blood, but the wound's not deep. I cleaned and bandaged it best I could." He nodded toward her arm, and Frances noticed the neat white bandage. "You want to tell me what kind of trouble has a young mother running through the wilderness with a baby?" Frances hesitated, studying the man before her. Henry Yates appeared to be in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and deep-set eyes the color of worn leather. His hands, though calloused, held Emma with the utmost care. Something in his steady gaze made Frances want to trust him. "My husband Daniel was murdered 3 days ago," she began, the words catching in her throat. "By the Blackwell gang. They're after me now, hired bounty hunters to track us down." Henry's expression darkened. "Blackwells have a nasty reputation. What'd your husband do to cross them?" "Nothing," Frances insisted. "Daniel was a freight manager for the railroad. They claimed he stole money from a shipment they had interest in, but he didn't. He wouldn't." She brushed away a tear. "They killed him anyway, and now they want me and Emma silenced too." Henry nodded slowly, rocking Emma gently as the baby's eyes began to close. "Nearest law is in Rawhide, good 20 miles south. Marshall there is a decent sort, but what? Blackwells have influence. Money talks even to lawmen sometimes." He studied her face. "You're welcome to stay here while you heal up. No one knows about this place except me and a few trusted friends." "I can't put you in danger," Frances protested, though the thought of running again made her body ache with exhaustion. "Madam, I've been putting myself in danger since I was 15. A wry smile crossed his face. "Been a scout, a tracker, even rode with the cavalry for a spell. I can handle a few bounty hunters." As if to punctuate his statement, thunder cracked overhead, followed by the steady drumming of rain on the cabin roof. Henry stood carefully, bringing Emma to Frances. "Storm set in. No one's tracking anything tonight. Get some rest, both of you." He handed the sleeping baby to Frances. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what's next." That night, Frances slept fitfully, waking at every sound. Emma, however, slept peacefully beside her, comforted by a full belly and warm surroundings. Frances watched Henry through half-closed eyes as he moved quietly about the cabin, checking the windows, cleaning his rifle, stoking the fire. There was an efficiency to his movements that spoke of years of self-reliance. When morning came, the rain had stopped, but low clouds still hung over the mountains. Henry was already awake, cooking something that smelled wonderful on the small cast iron stove. "Hope you like flapjacks," he said without turning around. "Not much for fancy cooking, but these'll stick to your ribs." Frances sat up, surprised at how much better she felt after a night's rest. "Flapjacks sound wonderful. I haven't eaten a proper meal since." She trailed off, not wanting to think about the last happy breakfast she'd shared with Daniel. Henry seemed to understand. He brought her a plate and set a cup of steaming coffee beside the bed. "Eat up. You'll need your strength." As Frances ate, she found herself studying the cabin. It was small but surprisingly comfortable, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, plus the small bedroom where she and Emma had slept. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books more than she would have expected for a bachelor's mountain hideaway. "You have quite a collection," she remarked, nodding toward the books. A hint of color touched Henry's cheeks. "Man gets lonely up here. Books make good company." "How long have you lived in these mountains?" "4 years," Henry replied, sitting down with his own plate. "Built this place myself after I left the cavalry. Wasn't planning on staying, but—" He shrugged. "Place grows on you." "What did you do before the cavalry?" A shadow crossed his face. "Bit of everything. Grew up on a farm in Missouri, left after the war. Parents didn't survive it." His tone made it clear he didn't wish to elaborate. "What about you? Before all this?" Frances looked down at Emma, who was beginning to stir. "I was a school teacher in St. Louis. Met Daniel when he came through with the railroad. We married, moved to Montana when he got promoted. We were going to build a life here," her voice caught. "Now I don't know what I'm going to do." Henry was quiet for a moment. "First thing is to keep you both alive. Those hunters will be searching again once the ground dries." "Maybe I should try to reach Rawhide," Frances suggested. "Find the marshal, explain what happened." Henry shook his head. "Too risky. Town's small, strangers get noticed, and like I said, Blackwells have connections." He set his empty plate aside. "Best play for now is to lay low, let them think you've moved on or—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Or died in the wilderness," Frances completed grimly. "It buys us time," Henry said. "I need to check if they're still searching nearby. You'll be safe here. Cabin's hard to spot unless you know it's here." Frances felt a surge of panic at the thought of being left alone. "What if they find this place while you're gone?" Henry crossed to a floorboard near the fireplace, lifting it to reveal a hidden compartment. He pulled out a revolver, checking it before handing it to Frances. "You know how to use this." Frances took the weapon, its weight unfamiliar in her hand. "Daniel taught me the basics." "Good. Stay inside, keep quiet. I'll be back before sundown." He hesitated, then added, "If I'm not back by dark, there's a path behind the cabin leads further up the mountain. Old mining cave about half a mile up. You could hide there." Fear tightened Frances's throat, but she nodded. Henry donned his hat and gun belt, then paused at the door. "You're stronger than you think, Mrs. Turner. You've kept yourself and your daughter alive this long. That's no small thing." With that, he was gone, leaving Frances alone with her thoughts and the soft sounds of Emma beginning to fuss for her morning feeding. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Frances tried to keep busy, washing the few items of clothing she had with her in a basin of water Henry had left. She found some dried apples and made a simple compote for Emma, who seemed to approve of the sweet taste. The cabin provided plenty to explore. Henry's books ranged from practical guides on hunting and tracking to dog-eared novels by Dickens and Twain. On a shelf near the bed, she discovered a small carved wooden horse, exquisitely detailed, and wondered about its significance. By late afternoon, Frances's nerves were stretched taut. Every rustle outside the cabin made her reach for the revolver. Emma, sensing her mother's anxiety, became fussy and difficult to console. The sun was beginning to dip toward the mountains when Frances heard it, the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats approaching. She quickly placed Emma in the center of the bed, surrounded by pillows, and took up position near the window, gun ready. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Henry's tall form and chestnut horse. But her relief turned to alarm when she saw he was slumped forward in the saddle, one hand pressed to his side. Frances rushed outside, forgetting caution in her concern. "Henry, what happened?" He dismounted stiffly, wincing as his boots hit the ground. "Found your pursuers," he said grimly. They didn't take kindly to my questions. Blood seeped between the fingers pressed to his left side. Frances helped him into the cabin, easing him onto a chair. "Let me see," she insisted, already reaching for the bandages Henry had used on her own wound. With reluctance, Henry removed his hand, revealing a deep gash along his ribs. "Knife," he explained tersely. "Got careless. Fella nearly gutted me before I could draw." Frances cleaned the wound with water and whiskey from Henry's small store, her hands steady despite her fear. The cut was deep but clean, and she stitched it with neat, even sutures using the sewing kit she found in Henry's supplies. "You've done this before," Henry observed, his breathing controlled despite what must have been considerable pain. "Help the doctor back home sometimes," Frances replied, focusing on her work. "What happened out there? Did you learn anything?" Henry's face darkened. "They're not giving up. 4 of them professional trackers by the look of them. They've figured out you crossed the creek, but the rain washed away the trail after that." He hissed as Frances tied off a stitch. "I tried to throw them off, suggested I'd seen a woman heading east toward the railway. Did they believe you? Hard to say. Their leader, big fella with a scar down his cheek, he's smart, didn't trust me from the start." Henry's eyes met hers. "They're camped at the base of the ridge, too close for comfort." Frances's hands stilled. "Then we need to leave." Henry shook his head. "Moving at night through these mountains with a baby is asking for trouble. Besides, they're watching the main trails." His gaze softened. "One more night here, I'll think of something." Frances finished bandaging his side, her mind racing with fear and questions. "Why are you doing this?" "You don't know me, don't owe me anything." Henry was quiet for a long moment. "Some debts aren't about owing," he finally said. "Sometimes it's about doing what's right because no one did it for you when you needed it." There was a story there, Frances sensed, but before she could ask, Emma began crying from the bedroom. As she rose to tend to her daughter, Frances felt Henry's hand catch hers briefly. "We'll get through this," he promised, his eyes steady on hers. For the first time since Daniel's death, Frances allowed herself to believe it might be true. That night, they took turns keeping watch. Frances insisted Henry rest first, his wound needing time to heal. She sat by the window, revolver in her lap, listening to the night sounds of the mountain wilderness. Emma slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle Henry had fashioned from a drawer. Around midnight, Henry joined her despite her protests that he should rest longer. "Can't sleep anyway," he admitted, easing himself into the chair beside her. "Too many thoughts." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the moonlight casting silver patterns through the window. "Tell me about your husband," Henry said softly. The request surprised Frances, but she found herself wanting to speak of Daniel. "He was kind," she began. "Thoughtful. Not the sort of man you'd notice in a crowd, but the kind who remembered how you took your tea or brought home wildflowers because they matched your eyes." She smiled at the memory. He was so excited about Emma, had all these plans for what he'd teach her. Henry nodded, his expression gentle. "Sounds like a good man." He was. Frances looked down at her hands. "The night it happened, we were at home. These men broke in, demanded money Daniel supposedly took. He kept telling them he didn't know anything about missing money. They didn't believe him." Her voice faltered. "They shot him right in front of me, said I was next, but I ran. Grabbed Emma and just ran." You did the right thing, Henry assured her. Did I? Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed, tried to convince them they would have killed you both, Henry interrupted firmly. You saved your daughter. Daniel would have wanted that. Francis wiped away a tear. Your turn. Tell me something about yourself, something real. Henry stared out the window for a long moment. I was married once, he said finally. Her name was Sarah. We had a little place near Fort Laramie. I was working as a scout for the cavalry then. His voice grew distant. There was trouble with some outlaws. I was gone when they came to our home. Sarah was alone. Francis didn't need to ask what happened. The grief in Henry's eyes told the story. I tracked them for months, he continued, found them eventually, made sure justice was served. The hardness in his voice made Francis shiver. Afterward, couldn't stand to be around people much. That's when I came here. I'm sorry, Francis said softly, understanding now why he'd been so willing to help her and Emma. Henry's gaze returned to her face. Life takes unexpected turns, Mrs. Turner. All we can do is keep moving forward. Francis, she corrected gently. After everything, I think you can call me Francis. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Francis, then. As dawn approached, Henry outlined his plan. There's an old trapper I know, lives about 15 miles north. Amos Bailey. Good man, trusted. He makes regular trips to Rawhide for supplies. We get to his place, he can take you to town under his protection, straight to the marshal. What about the hunters? They're watching the south trails, expecting you to head for town or the railroad. North through the high country, they won't be looking there. Henry stood carefully, testing his injured side. It's rough going, but I know paths they won't. Francis looked uncertain. You're injured. Maybe we should wait. Waiting gives them time to widen their search, Henry cut in. We leave at first light, travel through the day. With luck, we'll reach Amos by nightfall. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the trees, they prepared to depart. Henry packed sparingly ammunition, some dried meat and biscuits, a canteen of water. Francis bundled Emma securely against her chest with a length of cloth, creating a sling that would allow her to ride while keeping the baby safe. Henry saddled his horse, then helped Francis mount. I'll lead on foot, he explained. Easier to spot trouble that way, and the horse can't carry all three of us through this terrain anyway. They set off as the sun crested the eastern mountains, Henry leading the way along a barely visible game trail that wound upward through dense pines. The morning was clear and cool, the storm having washed the air clean. Under different circumstances, Francis might have found the mountain scenery breathtaking. Henry moved with the silent efficiency of a man accustomed to wilderness travel, pausing occasionally to listen or study the ground. His injury slowed him somewhat, but he made no complaint. Emma, miraculously, seemed to enjoy the gentle rocking motion of the horse and remained quiet. By midday, they had climbed high into the mountains, following a ridge that offered occasional views of the valleys below. During a brief rest, Henry pointed south. Rawhide's down there beyond that far ridge, can't see it from here. He handed Francis the canteen. About another 8 miles to Amos's place, but the worst of the climb is behind us. Francis drank gratefully, then used some of the precious water to dampen a cloth and cool Emma's flushed cheeks. The baby was being remarkably cooperative, considering the circumstances. She's a good traveler, Henry observed, a hint of admiration in his voice. Like her father, Francis replied with a sad smile. Daniel could sleep anywhere wagons, trains, once even standing up during a cattle drive. Henry chuckled, then winced, pressing a hand to his side. You're bleeding again, Francis noted with concern, seeing a fresh stain on his shirt. It's nothing, he dismissed. We need to keep moving. They continued north along the ridge, the the trail occasionally disappearing completely, forcing Henry to navigate by landmarks only he seemed able to recognize. By late afternoon, dark clouds were gathering again, and the wind carried the scent of rain. "Weather's turning," Henry muttered, glancing at the sky. "Need to pick up the pace." They had just started down a steep, rocky slope when Henry suddenly froze, raising his hand in a silent command to stop. Frances pulled the horse to a halt, her heart racing. "What is it?" she whispered. Henry didn't answer, his body tense as he scanned the valley below. After a long moment, he motioned her forward, his voice barely audible. "Riders, 3 of them moving up from the south." His expression was grim. "They've figured out we headed north." Fear clutched at Frances's throat. "Can they see us?" "Not yet, but they will if we keep on this trail." Henry studied the terrain, then pointed to a dense stand of trees about half a mile east. "There's a ravine through those pines. It's rough going, but it'll keep us hidden." They changed course, moving as quickly as safety allowed. The horse picked its way carefully down the slope, Henry leading it with one hand while the other rested on his revolver. The first fat raindrops began to fall as they reached the trees. The ravine was as treacherous as Henry had implied, a steep-sided cut through the mountainside, littered with fallen logs and slick, moss-covered rocks. The rain intensified, turning the ground into treacherous mud. Frances held Emma close, trying to shield her from the worst of the downpour. They had traveled perhaps a mile through the ravine when disaster struck. The horse stumbled on a slippery rock, letting out a startled whinny as it fought to regain its footing. The sound echoed through the ravine. Henry's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "They'll have heard that." Even as he spoke, a distant shout confirmed his fear. The hunters had heard and were changing direction. "Dismount," Henry ordered, already helping Frances down from the saddle. "We'll move faster on foot through this terrain. But Emma, keep her in the sling, stay close to me." Henry grabbed the saddlebags containing their supplies, then slapped the horse's flank. "Go on, girl, go home." The chestnut hesitated, then trotted away down the ravine. "Why did you do that?" Frances asked, confused. "She'll head back to the cabin eventually. With luck, they'll follow her trail and give us time to get away." Henry drew his rifle from its scabbard. "This way, stay low." They pushed through the underbrush, the rain providing cover but making the going treacherous. Emma began to whimper, uncomfortable and wet despite Frances's attempts to shield her. Henry led them up a nearly vertical slope, using tree roots as handholds. At the top, Frances gasped for breath, her legs trembling with exertion. Henry crouched beside her, his face pale with pain but his eyes alert. "Listen," he whispered. Through the drumming of the rain, Frances could hear men's voices and the sound of horses moving through the ravine below. One voice rose above the others, harsh and commanding, "Spread out." "They can't have gone far. Harley, check up that slope. Jensen, follow the horse." Henry's expression hardened. "They're splitting up. We need to move." He studied their surroundings, then pointed to a jumble of massive boulders about 100 yards away. "There. We can defend that position if needed." They had covered half the distance when a shout rang out behind them. "There they are, up on the ridge." A gunshot cracked, the bullet splintering bark from a tree near Frances's head. She clutched Emma tighter, fighting panic. "Run," Henry commanded, turning to fire his rifle at the pursuer. Frances ran, her boots slipping in the mud, branches whipping at her face. Behind her, she heard more gunfire, then Henry's footsteps as he caught up to her. They reached the boulders just as another shot rang out, this one closer. Henry pushed Frances into a narrow space between 2 massive rocks. "Stay here. Keep your head down." He positioned himself at the edge of the boulder, rifle ready. Frances pressed herself against the cold stone, trying to comfort Emma, who was now crying openly. "SHH, sweetheart," she whispered desperately. "Please, please be quiet." From her position, Frances could see Henry's face, set in grim determination as he watched the trees they had just fled. The rain continued to pour, running in rivulets down the rocks and soaking through her already drenched clothing. A movement in the trees caught her eye, a man advancing cautiously, rifle raised. Henry saw him too. His shot rang out and the man fell with a cry. "That's one," Henry muttered, already reloading. The fallen man's companions responded with a volley of gunfire that ricocheted off the boulders, sending stone chips flying. Henry pressed himself lower, waiting for a break in the shooting. "Mrs. Turner," a rough voice called from the trees. "We don't want to hurt the baby. Come out now and we'll let her live." Frances felt sick with fear, but Henry's steady gaze gave her courage. He shook his head slightly, a warning not to believe the false promise. "4 shots left," he whispered to her. "When I give the word, I want you to run northwest toward that tall pine. There's a drop-off behind it, a steep slope down to a stream. Follow the stream north. It leads to Amos's place eventually." "I'm not leaving you," Frances protested. "You have to. Emma needs you." His eyes were intense. "I'll hold them here, buy you time." "They'll kill you." A sad smile touched Henry's lips. "Maybe, but I've been living half a life since Sarah died anyway." He reached out, his rough hand gentle on her cheek. "You gave me something worth fighting for again. That's worth any price." Before Frances could respond, more gunfire erupted closer now. Henry turned, firing twice in quick succession. A scream told them his shots had found their mark. "That's 2, he said grimly. "At least one more out there, maybe 2. He looked back at Frances, his decision final. "Go, now." Tears blinding her, Frances clutched Emma and ran. The tall pine loomed ahead, and beyond it, just as Henry had said, the ground fell away sharply. She half ran, half slid down the steep slope, using one hand to steady herself while the other held Emma secure. Behind her, more gunshots rang out, then silence. The silence frightened her more than the shooting had. Had Henry fallen? Was he hurt? Dead? The slope ended at a fast-flowing stream swollen with rainwater. Frances followed it northward as Henry had instructed, moving as quickly as she dared on the slippery bank. Emma had quieted somewhat, exhausted from crying, her little face flushed and tear-streaked. "It's going to be all right," Frances promised, though she had no way of knowing if it was true. "We're going to be safe." She had followed the stream for perhaps half an hour when the rain finally began to ease. The forest around her was unfamiliar and growing darker as evening approached. Doubt crept in, was she still heading in the right direction? How would she find Amos's place without Henry to guide her? The sound of movement in the trees ahead made her freeze. Someone was coming. Frances looked around desperately for a hiding place, but the stream bank offered little cover. She pressed herself against a large tree, hoping the gathering darkness would conceal her. A figure emerged from the tree's tall, moving with a slight limp. Frances's heart leaped to her throat. "Henry," she called softly, hardly daring to hope. He turned toward her voice, and even in the dim light she could see his relieved smile. "Frances, thank God!" She rushed to him, nearly sobbing with relief. Henry was alive, though blood stained his shirt from a fresh wound on his arm. "You're hurt again," she said, reaching for his injured arm. "Bullet grazed me, nothing serious." He looked exhausted but determined. "We need to keep moving. I got 2 of them, but the others will regroup. Keep searching." "How did you find me?" "Tracked you. Wasn't hard, you followed my directions perfectly." There was pride in his voice. "Amos's place is about 3 miles north. If we push on, we can make it before full dark." They continued together, Henry setting a pace that was brisk but mindful of Frances's exhaustion and the precious bundle she carried. As they walked, he explained what had happened after she fled. Third man tried to flank me, but he was careless. Fourth one, their leader, he's smarter. Pulled back after I winged him. He'll gather the remaining man, come after us again." Henry's expression was troubled. "He's not giving up. Whatever the Blackwells are paying him, it must be a fortune." "Or they have something on him," Francis suggested. "Daniel always said the Blackwells controlled people through both greed and fear." They walked in silence for a time, the only sounds their footsteps and the rush of the stream beside them. The rain had stopped completely now, and breaks in the clouds revealed patches of darkening sky. "Tell me about your daughter," Henry said suddenly. Francis looked down at Emma, now sleeping despite their uneven pace. "She's 6 months old. Born last December, during the worst snowstorm I'd ever seen. Daniel rode 5 miles for the doctor, nearly froze to death getting there." She smiled at the memory. "Emma's been strong from the start, hardly cried at all when she was born, just looked around like she was curious about everything." "She takes after her mother," Henry observed. "Same fighting spirit." Francis felt a warmth that had nothing to do with exertion. "What about you? Did you and Sarah have children?" Pain flickered across Henry's face. "She was carrying our first when she died." "I'm so sorry," Francis whispered, understanding now another layer of his protectiveness toward Emma. Henry nodded once, accepting her sympathy without words. "There's Amos's place," he said, pointing to a faint light ahead. "We made it." The relief in his voice was palpable. Francis felt it too, the first real hope since this nightmare began. Amos Bailey's cabin was larger than Henry's, with a proper barn and corral for his horses. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the windows glowed with welcoming light. As they approached, a dog began to bark, announcing their presence. The door opened and a man appeared, shotgun in hand. He was older than Henry, with a white beard and weather-beaten face. "Who goes there?" he called. "It's Henry Yates, Amos. I've brought friends who need help." The old man lowered his shotgun, peering through the gloom. "Henry." "Lord above, boy, you look half dead. Get in here, all of you." The interior of Amos's cabin was warm and surprisingly comfortable. Francis sank gratefully onto a chair near the fire, carefully unwrapping Emma from her damp sling. The baby stirred, her little face scrunching up in preparation to cry. "Poor little mite's soaked through," Amos observed, setting his shotgun aside. "Martha," he called toward the back of the cabin, "bring some dry clothes for a baby." To Francis's surprise, a woman appeared from what must have been a bedroom, small and wiry, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "This is my sister," Amos explained, seeing Francis's confusion. "Moved in after her husband passed last winter." Martha took in the situation with a single glance. "Bring the child here," she said to Francis. "I'll get her dry and warm." Reluctantly, Francis handed Emma over, watching anxiously as Martha carried her to the bedroom. Henry placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "She's in good hands," he promised. Martha raised 5 children of her own. Amos was already tending to Henry's injuries, clucking disapprovingly at the knife wound in his side. "What kind of trouble you gotten yourself into this time, Henry?" Briefly, Henry explained the situation: Daniel's murder, the bounty hunters, their narrow escape. Amos listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Blackwells," he spat when Henry finished. "Scum of the earth, that family. Been throwing their weight around these parts for years." He looked at Francis. "I'm sorry about your husband, Mrs. Turner. No woman should have to endure what you have." "Thank you for taking us in," Francis said, fatigue evident in her voice. "No need for thanks. Any friend of Henry's is welcome here." Amos finished bandaging Henry's arm. "You both need rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out what's next." Martha returned with Emma, now dressed in a clean, if somewhat large, baby gown. "Found some things my granddaughter left behind," she explained, handing the contented baby to Frances. "She's a beautiful child." For the first time in days, Frances felt the tightness in her chest begin to ease. They were safe, at least for tonight. Emma was warm and dry, and Henry's wounds were being properly treated. Amos insisted they eat before resting a hearty stew that Frances hadn't realized how desperately she needed until the first spoonful touched her lips. Afterward, Martha showed them to a small but clean bedroom where a trundle bed had been pulled out alongside the main bed. "You and the baby take the bed," Henry insisted. "I'll be fine on the trundle." Too exhausted to argue, Frances settled Emma in the center of the bed, then lay down beside her, not even bothering to remove her boots. Her last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was that Henry was watching over them both, his rifle within easy reach. Morning came with the scent of coffee and bacon. Frances awoke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. The events of the previous days rushed back as she saw Emma still sleeping peacefully beside her. The trundle bed was empty, the blankets neatly folded. She found Henry at the kitchen table with Amos, the two men deep in conversation that stopped abruptly when she entered. "Good morning," Henry said, rising to pull out a chair for her. "You slept well, better than I have in days," Frances admitted, accepting a cup of coffee from Martha. "What were you discussing?" The men exchanged glances. "We need to get you to the marshal in Rawhide," Henry said finally. "Amos knows him well, says he's one of the few lawmen the Blackwells haven't bought." "Marshal Cooper's a good man," Amos confirmed. "If anyone can help you, it's him." "But the bounty hunters," Frances began. "They'll be watching the trails from here to town," Henry acknowledged. "That's why we came up with a plan." The plan, as they explained it, was both simple and risky. Amos would take Frances and Emma to Rawhide in his wagon, hidden under sacks of wool he was due to sell in town anyway. Henry would ride separately, taking a more visible route to draw attention away from the wagon if necessary. "It's dangerous," Frances protested, looking at Henry. "You're already hurt. If they see you, they'll focus on me, not Amos's wagon," Henry finished. "That's the idea. I don't like it. There must be another way." "There isn't," Henry said gently. "Not if we want to end this. The marshal is our best hope." Frances wanted to argue further, but Emma's morning cries from the bedroom interrupted her. By the time she'd tended to her daughter and returned, preparations were already underway. Amos was loading his wagon, while Martha packed food for the journey. Henry found Frances on the porch, watching Amos work while Emma nursed contentedly beneath a light blanket for modesty. "I know you're worried," he said, leaning against the porch railing, "but this is our best chance." Frances looked up at him, studying the face that had become so dear to her in such a short time. "Why are you really doing this, Henry? The truth." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the distant mountains. "When Sarah died, I thought that was it for me. Thought I'd live out my days alone in that cabin, just existing." He turned to look at her, his eyes softening. "Then you and Emma came along, and suddenly I had something worth fighting for again." "We've known each other 3 days," Frances said, though her heart beat faster at his words. "Some things don't need time," Henry replied simply. "Sometimes you just know." Emma finished nursing, and Frances adjusted her clothing before lifting the baby to her shoulder. Henry watched them with an expression that made her breath catch. "If we get through this," he said carefully, "if we make it to Rawhide and the marshal helps us." "What then?" The question hung between them, full of unspoken possibilities. "I don't know," Frances admitted. "I haven't thought beyond keeping Emma safe." Henry nodded, understanding in his eyes. "One day at a time, then." They departed an hour later, the wagon loaded with wool sacks under which a small space had been created for Francis and Emma. Amos sat on the driver's seat, looking for all the world like a simple farmer heading to market. Henry mounted a horse. Amos had loaned him a sturdy bay gelding. He would leave 15 minutes after the wagon, taking the main trail to town while Amos took a less traveled route. Before climbing into her hiding place, Frances stood beside Henry's horse, looking up at him with worry etched on her face. "Be careful," she said softly. "Please." Henry leaned down from the saddle, his hand gentle on her cheek. "I'll see you in Rawhide," he promised. Then, to her surprise, he bent further and kissed her a brief, tender touch that left her breathless. Before she could respond, Amos called that it was time to go. Frances climbed into the wagon with Emma, settling into the cramped space beneath the wool sacks. The last thing she saw before Amos covered their hiding place was Henry watching them, his expression a mixture of determination and something that looked remarkably like hope. The journey to Rawhide was uncomfortable but uneventful. The wool provided warmth, though the small space grew stuffy after a few hours. Emma, remarkably, seemed to enjoy the adventure, gurgling and playing with a strand of wool Frances gave her. Amos kept up a steady stream of cheerful conversation with passers-by they encountered, his manner so natural that no one would have suspected he carried precious cargo. By mid-afternoon, the wagon's motion changed as they began traveling on a more established road. Frances could hear more voices, the sounds of other vehicles. They must be nearing Rawhide. Her anxiety increased. Had Henry reached town safely? Were the bounty hunters waiting? The wagon came to a stop and Frances tensed. "Wolfer Market," came an unfamiliar male voice. "Same as every month," Amos replied casually. "Need to check my load, do you?" "No need, Bailey. Go on through." The wagon lurched forward again. They were in town, Frances realized. After a few more minutes, they stopped again, this time for longer. Frances heard Amos climb down from the driver's seat. "Stay put," he whispered near the wool sacks. "Need to make sure it's safe before I let you out." The waiting seemed interminable. Emma began to fuss, and Frances struggled to quiet her, fear making her heart race. What if the bounty hunters had found Henry? What if they were watching Amos right now? Finally, the wool sacks moved and light flooded their hiding place. Amos's weathered face appeared. "Quick now," he said, helping Frances and Emma out of the wagon. "We're behind the marshal's office." Henry's inside already. Relief washed over Frances at the news that Henry had arrived safely. Amos led them through a back door into a small, tidy office where a stern-looking man in a marshal's badge sat behind a desk. Henry stood nearby, his posture tense but uninjured. "Marshal Cooper," Amos said by way of introduction. "This is Mrs. Frances Turner and her daughter Emma." The marshal stood, his keen eyes assessing Frances. "Mr. Yates has told me your situation, Mrs. Turner, a troubling tale." "It's all true," Frances assured him, stepping forward. "The Blackwells murdered my husband and sent men to kill us. We've been running for days." "I believe you," Cooper said, his voice gruff but kind. "Blackwells have been skirting the law for years, but they've never been this bold before. Murdering a railroad man and hunting his family, that's federal territory." "What can we do?" Henry asked. "The hunters are still out there." Cooper stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "First, we get Mrs. Turner and the child somewhere safe. Then I send a telegram to the federal marshal in Helena. This is bigger than Rawhide now." "The hunters will be watching the town," Frances worried. "Let them watch," Cooper said grimly. "My deputy and I know every building and alley in Rawhide. We'll move you after dark, get you to the widow Jensen's boarding house. She's trustworthy and discreet." True to his word, when night fell, Cooper orchestrated their movement to the boarding house through a series of back alleys and service passages. The widow Jensen proved to be a formidable woman in her 60s who asked no questions and provided a comfortable room at the back of her establishment. "No one will bother you here," she assured Francis, cooing over Emma. "I've known Marshal Cooper 30 years. If he says you need protection, that's good enough for me." Henry insisted on staying, taking a small room adjacent to Francis and Emma's. "Just in case," he said, though they both knew the marshal had posted a deputy outside the boarding house. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep in a proper crib borrowed from one of the widow's previous tenants, Francis sat with Henry in the small sitting room attached to her bedroom. "What happens now?" she asked, the events of the past days catching up with her at last. Henry took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "Marshal Cooper is bringing in reinforcements. Federal marshals will handle the Blackwells. As for the bounty hunters," he shrugged. "Cooper's men are watching the town limits. If they show their faces, they'll be arrested. And after that, when it's safe." Francis hardly dared voice the question that had been on her mind since their conversation at Amos's cabin. Henry's eyes met hers, serious and intent. "That depends on you, Francis. I meant what I said before. These past days have changed me. Reminded me what it's like to have someone worth fighting for." He hesitated. "I know it's soon. I know you're still grieving Daniel, but when this is over, if you wanted. My cabin has room for a family." Francis felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unexpected gift of a second chance. "Daniel would have liked you," she said softly. "He always said life was too short not to grab happiness when you found it. Is that a yes?" Henry asked, hope illuminating his face. "It's a maybe," Francis replied, squeezing his hand. "Let's survive this first, then we'll talk about forever." Henry's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "That's good enough for me." The next 2 days passed in tense waiting. Marshal Cooper's telegram brought a swift response. A federal marshal would arrive within the week. In the meantime, Cooper increased patrols around town and stationed men at all entry points. On the 3rd day, their vigilance paid off. A stranger rode into town, asking suspicious questions about a woman with a baby. He was promptly arrested and identified as one of the bounty hunters Henry had wounded in the mountains. Under Cooper's questioning, the man broke, revealing that his partner, the leader with the scarred face, was still in the area, determined to complete his task. The revelation sent a chill through Francis. They weren't safe yet. That night, as a precaution, Marshal Cooper moved them to a new location, rooms above the bank, normally used by visiting bank examiners. The solid brick building with its heavy doors provided better security than the boarding house. As they settled in, Henry checked and rechecked the locks on the windows and doors. His protective instincts were in full force, and Francis found herself watching him with growing affection. "You need to rest," she told him gently. "You can't keep watch forever." "I'll rest when I know you're safe," he replied, though the shadows under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. Emma, oblivious to the danger, had thrived in the days since their arrival in Rawhide. Regular meals and proper shelter had restored her cheerful disposition. She now sat on a blanket on the floor, happily batting at a wooden toy one of the deputies had brought her. "Look at her," Francis said, nodding toward her daughter. "She knows she's safe because of you." Henry's expression softened as he watched Emma play. "She's a remarkable child." He looked up at Francis. Like her mother. The tenderness in his eyes made Francis's heart beat faster. Despite the danger still lurking, despite the grief that still visited her in quiet moments, she found herself drawn to this man who had risked everything to protect her and Emma. "Henry," she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her. They both tensed until Marshal Cooper's voice called out, "It's me. Got news." Henry checked through the peephole before opening the door. Cooper entered, removing his hat as he did so. "Federal Marshal arrived early," he announced. "Brought 4 deputies with him. They're setting out at first light for the Blackwell ranch." "That's good news," Henry said, though his expression remained cautious. "There's more," Cooper continued, his face grim. "My men spotted the scarred hunter outside of town. He's not alone, looks like he's hired local muscle." Frances instinctively moved to Emma, gathering her daughter into her arms. "We need to move them again," Henry said immediately. Cooper shook his head. "Too risky now that we know he's watching. Better to fortify this position and wait for the federal boys to deal with the Blackwells. Cut off the head and the rest will fall." "How long?" Frances asked. 2 days, maybe 3. Cooper replaced his hat. "I've assigned 2 more deputies outside. No one gets in this building without going through them first." After Cooper left, Henry resumed his vigilant checks of the rooms. Frances put Emma down for the night, singing softly until the baby's eyes fluttered closed. When she returned to the main room, she found Henry standing by the window, staring out at the darkened street below. "You heard the marshal," she said quietly. "We're safe here." Henry turned, his expression troubled. "I don't trust that scarred hunter to give up easily. Men like that, they take failure personally." Frances crossed to him, placing a hand on his arm. "You've done everything possible to protect us, more than anyone could have asked." "Not everything," Henry murmured. "Not yet." The intensity in his eyes made Frances catch her breath. Without thinking, she raised her hand to his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingers. "You need to shave," she said softly. A small smile touched his lips. "Haven't had much time for personal grooming lately." "I don't mind," Frances admitted. "It suits you." The air between them seemed to change, charged with unspoken feelings. Henry covered her hand with his own, turning his face slightly to press a kiss to her palm. "Frances," he said, his voice low. "I know this isn't the right time. I know you're still healing. But I need you to know a tremendous crash from downstairs cut him off. Shouting followed, then gunshots." Henry reacted instantly, pushing Frances toward the bedroom. "Get Emma and hide," he ordered, drawing his revolver. "Now." Frances ran to the bedroom, scooping up a startled Emma who began to cry at the sudden disturbance. Looking around frantically, she spotted a large wardrobe against the wall. She climbed inside with Emma, pulling the doors closed just as more gunshots rang out downstairs. Through the wooden doors, she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, then Cooper's voice shouting a warning. More gunfire, closer now. Emma wailed, frightened by the noise and Frances's fear. "SHH, baby, please," Frances whispered desperately, trying to comfort her daughter while straining to hear what was happening. A door splintered the main door to their rooms. Henry's voice called out a challenge, followed by the distinctive sound of his rifle firing. A man screamed in pain. Then more shots, the sound of furniture overturning, a heavy thud. Silence fell, broken only by Emma's quieter whimpers. Frances held her breath, terrified of what the silence might mean. Should she stay hidden? Try to escape? Footsteps approached the bedroom, slow, measured steps. The bedroom door opened. Frances pressed herself further into the wardrobe, one hand covering Emma's mouth to muffle her cries. "Frances," Henry's voice strained but alive. "It's over. You can come out." Relief flooded through her as she pushed open the wardrobe doors. Henry stood in the doorway, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead but otherwise unharmed. Behind him, Frances could see Marshal Cooper and a deputy securing 2 men on the floor, one of them the scarred hunter, now groaning and clutching a wounded shoulder. "You're hurt," Frances said, hurrying to Henry with Emma still in her arms. "It's nothing," he assured her, his free hand reaching out to touch Emma's back. "Just a graze." "Are you both all right?" Francis nodded, tears of relief threatening to spill. "What happened?" "They tried to come up the back stairs," Cooper explained, entering the bedroom. "My men caught them, but the scarred one, Jackson is his name, he's slippery. Got past us somehow." The marshal looked at Henry with newfound respect. "Good thing Mr. Yates here was ready for them." "Is it over?" Francis asked, hardly daring to hope. Cooper nodded. "Jackson was the last. The federal marshal will handle the Blackwells now." He tipped his hat to Francis. "You're safe, Mrs. Turner, truly safe." The aftermath unfolded rapidly. Jackson and his hired gun were jailed, and within days, news arrived that the federal marshal had arrested the Blackwell patriarch and his 2 sons. Evidence found at their ranch implicated them not only in Daniel's murder, but in a series of freight robberies and other crimes across the territory. "They'll hang," Cooper told Francis when he brought her the news, "or spend the rest of their days in a federal prison. Either way, they won't threaten you or anyone else again." With the danger finally past, Francis faced the question of what came next. Her home in Helena held too many painful memories to return to. The small amount of money Daniel had left wasn't enough to start over somewhere entirely new. A week after the attack at the bank, Francis sat in the widow Jensen's parlor, Emma playing contentedly at her feet while she considered her options. A knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Henry entered, looking more rested than she had ever seen him. He'd finally had time to shave and get a proper haircut. The change made him look younger, though no less capable. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, sitting down across from her. "About what?" Francis asked, though something in his expression made her heart beat faster. "About what comes next." He leaned forward, his eyes earnest. "I meant what I said before, Francis. My cabin has room for a family. It's not much, but I could build onto it, make it a proper home." Francis looked down at Emma, who had noticed Henry and was reaching for him with a happy gurgle. Without hesitation, Henry scooped her up, settling her comfortably in his arms. "You hardly know us," Francis said softly. "I know enough," Henry replied. "I know you're the bravest woman I've ever met. I know this little one has stolen my heart completely." He met Francis's gaze. "And I know that for the first time since Sarah died, I'm thinking about the future instead of the past." "It won't be easy," Francis warned. "I still have days when I miss Daniel so much it hurts to breathe." "I understand," Henry said gently. "I'm not asking you to forget him. Just to make room in your heart for something new, something that could grow with time." Francis studied his face, the earnest eyes, the quiet strength, the kindness that had been there from the first moment he'd helped her across that creek. In such a short time he had become someone she trusted completely, someone Emma reached for with joy. "I'd like to try," she said finally. "For Emma, for myself, for you." The smile that lit Henry's face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "That's all I'm asking for, a chance to try." 2 weeks later, they returned to Henry's cabin in the mountains, traveling with a proper wagon loaded with supplies and escorted by Amos Bailey, and 2 deputies Cooper had insisted on providing just to be safe. The journey was uneventful, the spring weather cooperative. As they approached the cabin, Francis was struck by how different everything looked in the soft light of peace rather than the harsh shadows of fear. The mountains were magnificent, the forest welcoming rather than threatening. "What do you think?" Henry asked as he helped her down from the wagon. "Still looks like a good hiding place." "It looks like a good home," Francis replied honestly. That night, after Emma was asleep in a proper crib, Henry had somehow acquired and transported all the way from Rawhide. They sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. "I've been thinking," Henry said, breaking a comfortable silence. "You seem to do a lot of that," Francis teased gently. He smiled, acknowledging her jest. "This place needs a name. Never bothered with one before, but now." He glanced at her. "Any suggestions?" Francis considered for a moment, looking out at the small clearing surrounded by protective pines, the stream gurgling nearby, the mountains standing sentinel in the distance. "Haven," she said finally, "because that's what it was for us when we needed it most." Henry nodded, satisfaction in his expression. "Haven it is." He reached for her hand, and Frances twined her fingers with his, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and survival, but also the gentleness that had cradled Emma and tended her wounds. "It won't always be easy," he said, echoing her earlier caution. "The best things rarely are," Frances replied, her voice sure now, "but we'll face it together." In the months that followed, their prediction proved true. There were challenges expanding the cabin to include a proper bedroom for Emma, establishing gardens that would help sustain them through winter, the occasional nightmares that still plagued Frances. But there were joys, too. Emma's first steps, taken across the cabin floor toward Henry's outstretched hands. The completion of the cabin addition, celebrated with a small gathering that included Amos, Martha, and even Marshall Cooper, who rode up from Rawhide. The growing ease between Frances and Henry as they learned each other's habits and hearts. By autumn, when the aspens turned gold and the air carried the first hint of winter, Frances knew it was time. One evening, as they sat by the fire after Emma had been put to bed, she turned to Henry. "I'm ready," she said simply. He looked at her, understanding in his eyes. "Are you sure?" Frances nodded. "Daniel will always have a place in my heart, but my heart has grown like you said it would. There's room now, room for you, Henry, room for us." 2 weeks later, they rode to Rawhide and were married by the justice of the peace, with Amos giving Frances away and the widow Jensen dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Emma, now walking confidently, toddled between them during the simple ceremony, bringing laughter to the solemn occasion. Their return to Haven no longer just Henry's cabin, but their home marked the beginning of a new chapter. Winter settled over the mountains, wrapping the small family in a blanket of snow and silence. On Christmas Eve, as they sat by the fire, Emma sleeping contentedly in the new bed Henry had crafted for her, Frances reached for her husband's hand. "I have something to tell you," she said, a smile playing at her lips. Henry turned to her, one eyebrow raised in question. "Come spring, Emma will have a brother or sister." The joy that spread across Henry's face was answer enough, but he gathered her in his arms anyway, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for trusting me, for giving me a second chance at life." Frances leaned back to look into his eyes, seeing there all the love and promise she had come to rely on. "We gave each other a second chance," she corrected gently, "and I plan to make the most of every day of it." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and silent over Haven. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, illuminating the small family that had found each other against all odds. Frances rested her head on Henry's shoulder, one hand on her still flat stomach, the other twined with his. They had begun in danger and desperation, a woman running for her life, a cowboy fighting for strangers. They had forged something precious from that chaotic beginning, a love built on courage and sacrifice, on protecting what mattered most. As the snow continued to fall and the fire burned low, Frances knew with absolute certainty that they had found something rare and beautiful. Not just a haven from the storm, but a place to belong. A family bound together not by blood, but by choice and love. And that, she thought as Henry's arm tightened around her, was the greatest gift of all. The years passed with the rhythm of seasons. Emma grew from toddler to child, her quick mind and adventurous spirit reminding Frances of Daniel in ways that brought smiles rather than tears. Jonathan, born the following spring, had Henry's quiet determination and steady hands. Haven expanded with their family a larger kitchen, a proper barn, gardens that yielded bountiful harvests. Henry's skill as a hunter and trapper provided well for them, while Frances began teaching Emma and later Jonathan their letters and numbers, establishing a small schoolroom in what had once been the main cabin. Visitors came and went, Amos and Martha for holiday celebrations, occasional travelers seeking shelter, even Marshal Cooper, who stopped by whenever his duties brought him to their part of the territory. Each visitor remarked on the same thing: the sense of peace that permeated Haven, the obvious happiness of the family that dwelled there. On Emma's 8th birthday, as they sat together watching the children chase fireflies in the summer twilight, Henry took Frances's hand. "Regrets?" he asked quietly, a question he still posed occasionally, as if reassuring himself that she was truly content with the life they had built. Frances squeezed his fingers, watching as Jonathan shrieked with delight when Emma presented him with a captured firefly in cupped hands. "Not one," she replied truthfully. "Every choice, every step, even the terrible ones, led us here. How could I regret that?" Henry's smile, still capable of quickening her heart after all these years, was answer enough. Later that night, with the children asleep and the cabin quiet save for the crackling fire, Frances found herself remembering the desperate woman who had stumbled across a creek with a baby clutched to her chest, running from death and toward an uncertain future. That woman could never have imagined the life that awaited her, the love she would find, the family she would build, the peace that would eventually heal her broken heart. "What are you thinking about?" Henry asked, noticing her contemplative mood. Frances smiled, leaning into his embrace. "About how sometimes the worst moments lead to the best ones, about how running for my life led me straight to you." "To us," Henry corrected gently. "To Haven." "To home," Frances agreed, and in that word was everything: safety, love, belonging. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched vast and beautiful under the summer stars. Inside, the fire burned low, casting golden light on the life they had built from danger and hope and second chances. It was, Frances thought as she closed her eyes, everything she could have wished for and more than she had ever dared to dream.